For the ones who work hard to ensure their crew can always go the extra mile, and the ones who get in early so everyone can go home on time, there's Grainger, offering professional-grade supplies backed by product experts so you can quickly and easily find what you need. Plus, you can count on access to a committed team ready to go the extra mile for you. Call, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
History as it happens, April 23, 2024, when Reagan pressured Israel.
The Israeli invasion of Lebanon has been deep and wide.
This council has treated with callousness and indifference all these years, all our complaints with regard to PLO barbarism originating from Lebanon against
Israel did not invade any country. We don't covet even 1 inch of Lebanese territory.
In Lebanon has shifted rapidly once again from the death of Lebanon's president-elect Bashir Jamal to what the Israelis have done here in Beirut today. What they have done is invade and occupy West Beirut.
Gunmen have marauded through 2 Palestinian refugee camps in West Beirut, executing unarmed men, women, and children.
Israel must have learned that there is no way it can impose its own solutions on hatreds as deep and bitter as those that produce this tragedy. If it seeks to do so, it will only sink more deeply into the quagmire that looms before it. Those outsiders who have fed the flames of civil war in Lebanon for so many years need to learn that the fire will consume them too if it is not put out. And we must all rededicate ourselves to the cause of peace.
40 years ago, an American president was willing to criticize Israel for its belligerence without severing the relationship. Ronald Reagan even cut off some arms shipments to Tel Aviv. Today, President Biden is facing pressure to exert U.S. influence to stop Israel's war in Gaza. But the circumstances are not entirely the same. What can we learn from this analogy? That's next as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
My colleagues across the aisle like to say that they support Israel.
But what Israel did not have the right to do and does not have the right to do is to go to war against the entire Palestinian people.
Since that horrific day on October 7th, I've called for aid to our ally Israel with no strings attached on this floor 4 times.
I have a pretty firm view that the only path towards some kind of sanity is the political one.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
August 20th, 1982.
Thank you all, and let me just say in advance, I'll be taking no questions because Secretary Schultz.
President Reagan announces U.S. Marines are heading to Lebanon as part of a multinational peacekeeping force.
The parties who made this plan possible have a special responsibility for ensuring its successful completion or implementation. I expect its terms to be carried out in good faith and in accordance with the agreed timetable. And this will require meticulous adherence to the ceasefire. Violations by any party would imperil the plan and bring renewed bloodshed and tragedy to the people of Beirut, and under no circumstances must that be allowed to happen. As you know, my agreement to include United States forces in a multinational force was essential for our success. In the days ahead, they and forces from France and Italy will be playing an important but carefully limited non-combatant role. The parties to the plan have agreed to this role and have provided assurances on the safety of our forces. Our purpose will be to assist the Lebanese armed forces in carrying out their responsibility for ensuring the departure of PLO leaders, officers, and combatants in Beirut from Lebanese territory under safe and orderly conditions. The presence of United States forces also will facilitate the restoration of the sovereignty and authority of the Lebanese government over the Beirut area. In no case will our troops stay longer than 30 days.
By September 1st, PLO forces were evacuated. Getting them out of Lebanon was one of the primary goals of the Israeli invasion in June, and the Marines were withdrawn. These were important initial steps, as Reagan saw it, toward reestablishing Lebanon's sovereignty and resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But Lebanon, which had been devoured by civil war since 1975 and had been invaded by Syria too, would soon come apart at the seams. As historian William Cleveland writes in A History of the Modern Middle East, when in late August Bashir Gemayel was chosen as Lebanon's president, it appeared the Israeli government had achieved all its objectives. 2 weeks after the election, however, Gemayel was assassinated, and the Sharon-Begin scheme, that would be Ariel Sharon and Menachem Begin, began to unravel. In the wake of the assassination, Israel violated the evacuation agreement by sending its army into West Beirut. Instead of protecting the civilians as it claimed it was doing, the Israeli military allowed units of the Phalange militia to enter the Palestinian refugee camps of Sabra and Shatila and massacre men, women, and children who had been left unprotected by the PLO evacuation. The atrocities at Sabra and Shatila produced an international outcry, writes Cleveland, against the entire Lebanese invasion and a wave of revulsion within Israel.
The scenes that the whole world witnessed this past weekend were among the most heartrending in the long nightmare of Lebanon's agony. Millions of us have seen pictures of the Palestinian victims of this tragedy. There's little that words can add, but there are actions we can and must take to bring that nightmare to an end.
Earlier that summer, Reagan stopped the shipment of cluster shells to Israel so his administration could review whether Israel's use of the weapons violated agreements by killing civilians with them. And as William Inboden writes in his book on Reagan's foreign policy, The Peacemaker, Reagan's mounting fury toward Israel coincided with his growing realization that the Middle East could not be seen only through the lens of the Cold War, but how it should be viewed was a murkier question. Inboden goes on to say there was a meeting on August 3rd in the State Department's Operations Center. Reagan alternated between anger at the PLO and anger at Israel. He rewrote a draft letter to Begin and read it to his team. His missive blamed Israel's aggression for the latest impasse and concluded with a threat shorn of the usual diplomatic finesse. The relationship between our two countries is at stake. World War II loomed over Reagan and Begin's exchanges, writes Inboden. In one tense phone call, Reagan told Begin that Israel's bombardment was causing a Holocaust in Beirut. So maybe it's surprising to learn that any president condemned, at least in private, the leadership of a country that has enjoyed so close a relationship with the United States. Lawrence Korb, a former Assistant Secretary of Defense in Reagan's first term, writes, Reagan actually allowed 21 UN resolutions that directly or indirectly condemned Israeli behavior and actions to pass. These included condemning Israel for the bombing of Lebanon, Iraq, and Tunisia. In addition to not vetoing UN resolutions, Korb writes, Reagan took several actions that many in Israel and the United States perceived as anti-Israel. For example, in June 1981, less than 6 months after Reagan took office, Israel launched a surprise bombing raid on the Iraqi nuclear reactor at Osirak, and in doing so violated the airspace of Saudi Arabia and Jordan. Reagan not only supported UN Security Council Resolution 487, which condemned the attack, but he also criticized the raid publicly and suspended the delivery of advanced F-16 fighter jets to Israel. Moreover, Korb writes, over the strident objections of Israel and the pro-Israel U.S. lobby groups, Reagan approved the sale of advanced reconnaissance aircraft, AWACS, to Saudi Arabia, which Israel then viewed as a hostile state. By comparison, President Obama allowed only one UN resolution critical of Israel to get through the UN Security Council during the 8 years of his presidency. I'll put a link to Korb's piece, which he wrote for ResponsibleStatecraft.org, in my weekly newsletter, and you can sign up for that at historyasithappens.com or search for History As It Happens on Substack. So what accounts for this change? The United States, once a neutral broker in the Middle East, today supports Israel almost unconditionally. Well, a lot has changed, of course, not just in U.S. politics, and not just in the Middle East, where most Arab states now want better relations, even normalized relations with Israel. That was certainly not the case in the 1970s and 80s. The Cold War is over, and unlike the 1982 invasion, today's war in Gaza was provoked by a savage terrorist attack by Hamas on Israeli civilians, killing around 1,200 people and taking more than 200 hostages. And some of those hostages are still being held today. There is a constant here. His name is Joseph Biden.
If we look at the Middle East, I think it's about time we stop, those of us who support, as most of us do, Israel in this body, for apologizing for our support for Israel. There's no apology to be made. None. It is the best $3 billion investment we make. Were there not an Israel, the United States of America would have to invent an Israel to protect her interest in the region. The United States would have to go out and invent an Israel.
And that was Biden on the Senate floor in 1986. You know, it's not often I cite Nicholas Kristof of the New York Times here, but he wrote a column the other day about how Biden is risking his re-election by refusing to effectively pressure Israel to cease hostilities in Gaza. Kristof writes, in 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon and caused so many civilian casualties that everyone from President Ronald Reagan to Democratic senators was outraged. One exception, Kristof writes, a young senator from Delaware. Then Senator Biden clashed with Israel's hardline Prime Minister Menachem over West Bank settlements, and he deserves credit for being prescient about his opposition to land grabs for settlements. But Biden reportedly also told Begin that he favored an even harsher attack on Lebanon, even if this meant killing women and children, according to Israeli press reports. And that again is Nicholas Kristof. So what can we learn from this analogy? Reagan exerting influence to protect U.S. interests in the Middle East and avoid a larger war. Biden today refusing to go beyond issuing some harsh words about Israel's behavior, but not, say, cutting off weapons shipments as Reagan did. Analogies are important, not only to identify similarities or continuities between past and present, but also to understand what has changed since 1982 and 1983 for that matter, the year U.S. involvement in Lebanon provoked massive violence on the part of Shia terrorists. First at the U.S. Embassy in the spring, then at the Marine Barracks in October.
The Pentagon now estimates that 120, possibly more, 120 American Marines have been killed. 45 of the more critically wounded have been evacuated. Others remain to be evacuated later.
But I think we should all recognize that these deeds make so evident the bestial nature of those who would assume power if they could have their way and drive us out of that area, that we must be more determined than ever that they cannot take over that vital and strategic area of the earth, or for that matter, any other part of the earth.
Salim Yaqub is a historian at UC Santa Barbara, specializing in U.S. foreign relations and the Middle East in the post-war era. That would be post-1945. He is the author of Imperfect Strangers, Americans, Arabs, and the U.S. Middle East Relations in the 1970s. That was published in 2016. And Winds of Hope, Storms of Discord, the United States since 1945. That was published last year. Salim Yaqub, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
When we talk about the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, this war, the 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon, seems to be maybe overlooked a little bit in contextual analysis. In the public mind, we talk about 67, 73, Oslo in 93. What about the Israeli invasion of 1982? Is it understudied in your view?
I don't think it's understudied by people who specialize in my field, but perhaps it is, as you suggested, not as well remembered as it ought to be. And partly it's because it's now more than 40 years ago. There's been plenty of other carnage taking place. So it's understandable. People don't pay it as much attention as you or I would like them to, but it's great we have this opportunity to dig more deeply into it now.
Yeah, I think there's some important parallels here. We have to be careful about overstating them and drawing too many comparisons that maybe don't work.
Sure.
The contexts are, of course, different. I mean, to start with, in those days, Israel was still mostly surrounded by hostile states, whereas today, most of the Arab countries want to have better relations with Israel. In fact, some of them helped Israel defeat the Iranian drone and missile strikes last week.
Right.
Maybe we'll get to that a little bit later. Why don't we just start with the war, 1982. This was the second time Israel invaded Lebanon, but the second time was much larger. It was a full-scale war. Why did Israel invade Lebanon, or what were its main goals?
Well, that's actually a question that historians have debated to some extent, because there appears to be some disconnect between what Israel claimed it was seeking to achieve and what analysts both at the time and since have speculated as being the primary or maybe more revealing motive. Well, the Israelis claimed that they were subjected to an intolerable barrage of attacks from PLO bases in Lebanon, and that they had to go in and take those bases out. And beyond that, actually remove the PLO from Lebanon altogether. Now, there were border skirmishes, there were exchanges of rocket fire between Israeli and PLO forces over the preceding years. But in fact, in the period immediately preceding the Israeli invasion, there actually had not really been that much in the way of PLO rocket fire. And so what analysts both at the time and in the years since have speculated is that what Menachem Begin, the prime minister of Israel at that time, was really hoping to do was defeat the PLO diplomatically more than militarily. In the years leading up to the 82 invasion, there had been a pretty remarkable diplomatic transformation in the politics of the Arab-Israeli conflict, such that the PLO had gained considerable degree of international legitimacy. More and more countries around the world were recognizing the PLO as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. There was growing pressure on Israel to talk to the PLO to reach some sort of an accommodation that would result in basically a two-state settlement. That scenario of a two-state settlement was really starting to take hold at that time. And a big part of that was a transformation in the PLO's own position from basically a rejectionist stance, saying that Israel was completely illegitimate, it needed to be dismantled, and all of Palestine had to be liberated so that a Palestinian state, an Arab Palestinian state could be established there. That was the initial PLO position, but by the late 70s, even though the PLO had not formally signed on to this, it had signaled in all sorts of ways that it was prepared for compromise.
1974 was when Arafat drops the full rejectionist position. Although, of course, he's not abandoning armed resistance because there's still these guerrilla raids from southern Lebanon after the PLO had been kicked out of Jordan. They're operating out of Lebanon and attacking into Israel.
It's a very ambiguous stance that Arafat is taking, where on the one hand, he's continuing to endorse the armed struggle and to lend support, both rhetorical and material, to Palestinian factions that are engaged in the armed struggle against Israel. But he's also saying that what the PLO is aiming for is establishment of a state on whatever territory can be liberated. That was the stance in 1974. He did not recognize Israel, did not place formal limits on Palestinian ambitions. He still actually said that, yes, all of Palestine should be for the Palestinian people. But by saying we will establish a state on whatever territory is liberated, implied that Israel could continue to exist in the territory that was not liberated. So that was kind of a halfway or a stepping stone in the PLO position. You inch toward recognition, but it would take another maybe 15 years, really not till the late 80s, for the PLO to recognize Israel formally.
Yeah, and that halfway position was not very popular in Israel. But yes, the idea of a
to say the least.
The idea of a two-state solution was gaining steam. Camp David, at least the meeting was in 78. The treaty is signed between Egypt and Israel in 1979, with implications for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
It deals specifically with the future of the West Bank and Gaza and the need to resolve the Palestinian problem in all its aspects. The framework document proposes a 5-year transitional period in the West Bank and Gaza, during which the Israeli military government will be withdrawn and a self-governing authority will be elected.
And when the Reagan administration takes power in 1981, there was a person by the name of Bob Ames in the CIA. He had been working on this. He was an Arabist at the CIA for quite a bit. We'll return to the U.S. position in a moment, but I think we need to touch on a little bit more context about 82 and the Israeli motives, because we're dealing with Lebanon, a country that had been devoured by civil war since 1975. And the Israelis had an interest in installing a friendly Maronite Christian leader in Beirut, the Maronites being at war with the PLO because the central government was either unable or unwilling to get rid of them. And then the Maronites were also at war with other Muslim militias when the confessional arrangements broke down in Lebanon. The complexities of the Lebanese civil war, we'd spend all day on it, but why don't you pick it up from there, just a little bit of context about what was happening at the time.
Sure. To continue the point I was making about the growing legitimacy of the PLO diplomatically, this created a real crisis for the government of Israel, which, especially under the leadership of Menachem Begin, had no interest whatsoever in any kind of accommodation with the Palestinians, at least one that involved the relinquishing of territory. Menachem Begin, as you know, was fully committed to retaining all of the occupied territories. He believed that they had been granted to the Jews by God. So there was a theological and a security-based rationale that he had for taking that position. So he really felt that something needed to be done to cut the PLO down to size. And so his idea was to go in and deal it such a crippling blow that it would no longer wield the kind of influence that it was starting to wield in international diplomatic affairs. And yes, and part of that was, as you said, this alliance that Israel had established with the Lebanese Maronite militia led by Bashir Gemayel. And the idea was to remove the PLO and try to install Gemayel as the president of Lebanon, which actually was achieved. But as many of your listeners will probably already know, that was a very short-lived victory because within, I'm not sure whether it was days or weeks of his election as president, the Lebanese parliament elected Gemayel president essentially under the guns of the Israeli occupying forces. He was killed in a car bomb. And that set in motion a whole train of disastrous events that we can get into.
Yeah, we will.
But yes, the idea was not simply to free Israel of the danger posed by PLO rocket fire, but rather to achieve something much broader and more geopolitically consequential.
Gemayel was the son of Pierre Gemayel,
correct,
who was the leader of the Phalange, the Phalangists.
Yes.
Briefly, I haven't been able to pin down who actually assassinated Gemayel. Was it a Syrian intelligence operative?
I believe that's the case. To be honest with you, it's been some time since I've read up on what the latest intelligence or scholarly knowledge of that is. It was strongly suspected at the time that it was somebody linked to Syria.
And Syria was occupying part of Lebanon as well. It had invaded.
Correct.
Lebanon was a failed state, if you will. The Israelis also, William Cleveland makes this argument in a book I'm always using these days as a reference, A History of the Modern Middle East. Number one, Israelis want to, as you said, destroy the PLO bases in southern Lebanon, really the entire belt from southern Lebanon to Beirut, where the PLO had immersed itself in the Palestinian refugee camps. And these are the refugees from 1948. Number two, install a Maronite Christian leader in Beirut. But number three, isolate Palestinians on the West Bank, so the West Bank could be
right.
And
yes.
So you agree with that then?
Yes, yeah, I think so. I mean, the real prize in all of this was the West Bank. The Israeli government, especially under Menachem Begin, was determined at all costs to hold on to the West Bank and not succumb to any pressure to withdraw from it or reach any kind of agreement with the Palestinians over it, beyond the most minimal sorts of autonomy agreements that Begin had signaled his acceptance of. Yeah. But that would really have limited the Palestinians to, managing their very mundane municipal affairs, directing traffic, throwing out garbage, and the Israelis would continue to control the area from a security standpoint and also continue to populate it with Jewish settlers. The effort is successful in the sense that it does result in the PLO's ouster from Lebanon. They end up relocating to Tunis, hundreds of miles away from Palestine.
Yeah, first time not contiguous to their homeland, operating.
Right.
So the Israelis misled public opinion, misled the United States, right, about what their aims were.
Yes, I think that's fair to say. Misled their own public opinion, misled elements of the cabinet and the Knesset, and certainly the Reagan administration, because the official version of what Israel was going to do was to head up about 20 miles north of the Israeli-Lebanese border and secure that area, but not move beyond it. But very quickly, the Israelis moved beyond that perimeter and in very short order reached Beirut and started besieging the capital. And that was well beyond anything that they had formally told the Reagan administration that they would do. So, of course, it does pose a serious problem for the Reagan administration.
And there's never a good time for a war to arrive, but when this one happens, it wasn't a great time for Reagan and his people. There was a lot of infighting within the administration. New Secretary of State, I think, was sworn in right about that day, George Shultz. William Inboden, who wrote a study of Reagan's foreign policy, The Peacemaker, I'm holding the book here. The Middle East was a place where Reagan really never understood, never had a great feel for it. So this war erupts, and he says here that Reagan and Shultz feared Sharon's dream might instead destroy Lebanon, Ariel Sharon being the Israeli defense minister who wanted to drive all the way to Beirut and install a friendly government, might instead destroy Lebanon and set the entire Middle East aflame. As soon as Israeli tanks had breached the border, Reagan dispatched Phil Habib back to the region for yet another round of talks to forge a ceasefire, if not a peace settlement. So why don't we talk a little bit more now about how did the Reagan administration react to this? It seems that they were pretty angry about it.
This is a really fascinating drama, really, when you look at it more closely. You mentioned George Shultz. I mean, he comes in as a consequence of the downfall of Reagan's first Secretary of State, Al Haig, who actually took a much more pro-Israeli line than many other members of the administration. While he may not have, in any direct sense, given the Israelis a green light, that was the phrase that was used at the time, green light to go into Lebanon, he certainly intimated that the Reagan administration would be quite forgiving of any Israeli moves that went beyond this limited operation that the Israelis were formally announcing. So there was kind of a wink and a nod coming from Al Haig. But then because there was so much unhappiness within the Reagan administration over what the Israelis were doing, Haig found himself in an embattled position. And he had been contradicted or schooled on a number of other issues. And so he felt this was kind of the final straw. And well, actually, he threatened to resign on a number of occasions. And I think finally Reagan himself just got fed up and accepted one of his resignation offers in a way that Haig himself was not really expecting to happen. That's right. But anyway, Haig was out and Shultz came in. Shultz was, by reputation, somebody who would take a more sympathetic view toward the Arabs in general, because he had lots of business dealings in the Arab world, especially in Saudi Arabia. In the end, he turned out to be quite a bit more sympathetic to the Israelis than many expected he would be. But certainly the turmoil over Lebanon, which was unfolding when he was sworn in, was a very serious issue for him and something he had to address.
Reagan allowed 21 UN resolutions that directly or indirectly condemned Israeli behavior and actions to pass at the UN Security Council. He was not anti-Israel. He supported the Jewish state. He just had problems with what it was doing there, especially in this case. This is somewhat of a digression, but I often am puzzled at where it comes from, this idea that Republicans have always been more supportive of Israel than Democrats, when the historical record is actually different than that. It's the opposite.
Oh, sure. The Democratic Party was, for a few decades, arguably the party that was more supportive of Israel, in large part because there were many more American Jews supporting the Democratic Party than the Republican Party. Also, the overall image of Israel in the United States was that of a democratic, progressive, even in some respects, socialist-ish society. And so there were elements of the American left, not just the Democratic Party, but people to the left of the Democratic Party, especially in the late 40s and into the 50s and 60s, who strongly identified with Israel, saw it as a progressive answer to the plight of Holocaust survivors and presenting some kind of a model for other countries in the region to follow and for Americans themselves in some ways to follow. So yeah, there was a very strong bond between the Democratic Party as a whole and Israel. The Israeli invasion of 1982 was a significant event in the gradual transformation of that picture, where even though in 82 itself, if you looked at what people were saying in Congress, you'd find plenty of Democrats, maybe even more Democrats than Republicans, supporting Israel and criticizing the Reagan administration for not being sufficiently supportive of Israel. So whenever Reagan denounced something that the Israelis were doing, you would often get pushback from Congress. And because this is a partisan situation, it's often the Democrats who are more loudly denouncing the administration for not having Israel's back. But what 82 did was also present a picture of Israel to the broader American public that was at odds with the more benign image that had been dominant in previous decades. Israel was seen to be engaging in a war of choice, conducting military operations that were resulting in very significant civilian casualties. Israel was aligned with the Phalangist Party, as you mentioned, which in the immediate aftermath of Bashir Gemayel's assassination went into Palestinian camps of Sabra and Shatila and massacred hundreds of Palestinians.
The killers, members of a Lebanese rightist militia, got away as easily as they had arrived. To do so, they had to pass through Israeli lines, and the extent of Israeli collusion in the massacre has caused a political storm.
Israel must have learned that there is no way it can impose its own solutions on hatreds as deep and bitter as those that produced this tragedy. If it seeks to do so, it will only sink more deeply into the quagmire that looms before it.
It's hard to see how the Israelis could not have understood at the time that this was taking place, even though they claimed that this took them by surprise and horrified them as much as it horrified everybody else. So these are the things that are taking place in 1982 that are conflicting with the more benign image of Israel that had been dominant in previous decades. Even though you don't see an official democratic reaction to that in real time, it starts in motion a chain of events that will lead to more and more questioning of Israel that ends up being more pronounced and visible in the Democratic Party than in the Republican Party. And then one other part of it is the growing influence of Christian evangelicals, who, for their own theological reasons, feel that it's imperative for the United States to support the most hawkish, belligerent elements of the Israeli government.
Eschatology. It's eschatological.
The end times narrative requires that Israel retain control of Jerusalem and other portions of the so-called Holy Land. Yeah.
So there is anti-Israel sentiment on the left, or just people who are genuinely unhappy with Israel's behavior today, for instance. But for the most part, the mainstream Democratic Party is still very pro-Israel. One of the reasons I wanted to bring you on here was to discuss President Biden's position toward Israel versus the way Ronald Reagan handled it during this major war in 1982, because Reagan, and at least the United States more broadly during this period, was looked at as more of a neutral, honest broker that wasn't taking one side or the other because, and I think Reagan was right, he believed that it was in U.S. interest to prevent a war from escalating. I mean, this is what Biden is being criticized today, not just the humanitarian issues. Scholars like Trita Parsi have made this argument on my show, that we're risking escalation of a wider war here by not using more of U.S. influence, more U.S. leverage on Israel. It's not really a question, Saleem, so I will eventually pose a question here. Well, we'll return to 1982. Reagan was hesitant to send in the Marines. He wound up doing it twice out of necessity.
Right.
But he also saw what was going on there through a Cold War lens. He saw what was happening as a possible barrier to his goal of eliminating Soviet influence in the Middle East as well, right?
Yes. So yeah, Reagan, as everyone knows, was a very staunch Cold Warrior. And to some extent, that pushed him to back Israel, because there was this idea that Israel is a staunch ally of the United States in a region dominated, or at least populated, by regimes that are not only hostile to Israel, but also hostile to the United States and getting support from the Soviet Union. And this was a line that Israel and its supporters constantly sounded, which is that Israel is a strategic asset for the United States. It can help the United States wage the Cold War in the Middle East by going after radical Arab groups like the PLO, regimes like the Syrian regime or Libya or what have you. And Reagan is to some extent susceptible to that line of thinking. He has some sympathy for it. But there's also a countervailing Cold War reading of the Arab-Israeli conflict that inclines one to be far less supportive of Israel, or at least of Israel's more aggressive behavior. And this is the notion that as long as Israel continues to occupy Arab territory, as long as it remains in a very hostile relationship with most of the Arab world, that gives opportunities for the Soviet Union to gain influence in the region because it can pose as the Arabs' defenders, as the Arab supporters, and forge productive and beneficial agreements and treaties and so forth with a growing number of Arab states. This thinking leads to the argument that if we really want to win the Cold War, what we need to do is push for a resolution of the Israeli-Arab conflict, and especially the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, thereby reduce the temperature, deprive the Soviet Union of opportunities to gain influence in the region. And Reagan is susceptible to that thinking as well. And in particular, he sees the continuation of the status quo in the Middle East, which that, of course, becomes much worse with the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, as imperiling U.S. relations with pro-U.S. Arab regimes, especially oil-rich ones like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, United Arab Emirates, and even countries like Jordan and Egypt that are not wealthy, but they are strategically important to the United States. So that's kind of the dilemma that you see in the Reagan administration itself, with various figures in the administration taking one side or the other.
Yeah, there was infighting.
Reagan is buffeted between those two visions. And because he himself is often very aloof, not particularly well informed about the details of this dispute.
Yeah, as I mentioned, he didn't really get the Middle East that well versus other parts of the world. He never visited the Middle East during his presidency.
Is that right?
Yeah, according to In Bowden here, have the book The Peacemaker about Reagan's foreign policy. So the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, second one, begins in June of 1982. Things get really bad in August. Israel is laying siege to Beirut, West Beirut, where the PLO had their headquarters. Reagan actually cut off the transfer of cluster shells, not cluster bombs, cluster shells and artillery to Israel because there were concerns that they were being used to kill civilians. Reagan has a telephone call with Menachem Begin at this time. What happened there?
There are a couple of different moments that people often refer to. I believe the telephone call may have been earlier in the summer where he very forcefully objected to what Israel was doing in Lebanon and saying that if the Israelis did not cease and desist in very short order, this would very significantly affect U.S.-Israeli relations. And then there's a later occasion when Reagan sends a letter to Menachem Begin in August, which essentially makes the same point, but using language that was really quite extraordinary. Reagan actually refers to what Israel is doing in Lebanon as a Holocaust. It really pushes the moral depravity of what is taking place. And I think this is one of those instances where Reagan was personally and viscerally strongly affected by what was taking place. As I said, he tends to be very aloof and distant from a lot of the inner workings of his administration, but there are certain issues or certain events that really reach him on a personal level.
Yeah, he said to one Israeli official, the television is showing the human results of the use of phosphorus bombs, burned babies. And as you mentioned, what he said to Begin about the Holocaust, Begin was infuriated by this because his parents and brother were murdered in the Holocaust. Reagan was outraged, and he said things that maybe some admirers of Reagan today or people who support Israel or maybe don't support Israel would not be aware of. That an American president read the Israeli prime minister the riot act over what was going on there. I mean, how much influence did this have in eventually reaching, I guess you would call it a ceasefire, where then Reagan decides to send the Marines in a multinational force?
Our purpose will be to assist the Lebanese armed forces in carrying out their responsibility for ensuring the departure of PLO leaders, officers, and combatants in Beirut from Lebanese territory under safe and orderly conditions. The presence of United States forces also will facilitate the restoration of the sovereignty and authority of the Lebanese government over the Beirut area. In no case will our troops stay longer than 30 days.
So how important was Reagan's intervention here in ending the war or ending the hostilities at this point?
I think it had some impact, but maybe not quite as decisive as it's sometimes portrayed. I mean, because essentially Israel was close to having achieved its objective already. And its main objective was getting the PLO out of Lebanon. And that actually was achieved in the weeks following the ending of this particular assault on Beirut.
That's right. The PLO finally gave in and said, all right, we'll leave. We're out of here.
This was something that, the Reagan administration also very strongly endorsed and worked to achieve and saw it as a great victory to get the PLO out of Lebanon. Begin was getting what he wanted in a very important respect, even as he was being forced to sort of hasten the timetable of this one particular aspect of the military operation. Reagan did make an important difference in the sense that Begin committed to ending the bombardment of Beirut, but it was in the context of a broader process whereby the United States was working in parallel with Israel in many significant ways. What you see in the year following is a series of diplomatic events that show that the Reagan administration was pretty closely aligned with Israel. And I don't know if you want to get into this. I think it is important for understanding the bombing of the Marine barracks in October 1983.
Sure, please.
There was this peace initiative that Secretary Shultz pursued in the spring of 1983, essentially resulted in a peace treaty between Israel and Lebanon. But it ended up throwing Lebanon into such turmoil, giving a diplomatic and geopolitical advantage to Syria in ways that blew back really disastrously against the United States.
Yeah, please go on. Yeah.
Okay, so the PLO is forced to evacuate or compelled to evacuate Lebanon. You then have the assassination of Gemayel and the massacre of the Palestinians in Sabra Shatila, which prompts the United States to send the Marines back to Lebanon. They had been stationed there previously, had been pulled out when they thought that they had achieved this agreement over the PLO. But because of the turmoil resulting from the assassination of Gemayel and the massacre of the Palestinians, the Marines go back.
I have consulted with our French and Italian allies. We have agreed to form a new multinational force similar to the one which served so well last month, with the mission of enabling the Lebanese government to resume full sovereignty over its capital, the essential precondition for extending its control over the entire country.
So you've got the Marines now stationed in Lebanon, and ostensibly they're there to keep the peace and to promote stability. But for many people in the region, they are seen as anything but neutral. They're at the, with the blessing of the Lebanese government, which is now headed by Bashir Gemayel's brother, Amin Gemayel, who he's somewhat more moderate and, doesn't have the same bloody history that Bashir Gemayel did. But nonetheless, he himself is a leader of the same Phalangist party.
He's a Christian in a Shia majority country, and that confessional division where the parliament, for instance, had to have 6 Christians for every 5 Muslims, even though there were many more Muslims in the country. That's what led to the civil war. And at this point, you have many Shia people who are very unhappy with everything that's going on. Many of them had been displaced by Israeli shelling of southern Lebanon, forced into the slums of Beirut. I mean, this is where we get Hezbollah.
Yeah.
Not to jump too far ahead, but go ahead to your point.
Right. You said Shia majority. I think you meant to say Muslim majority.
Muslim majority.
Which is itself not entirely clear, but probably true. A census had been taken back in 1930 in Lebanon, and it had shown a small Christian majority. And so on the basis of that, all of the government positions were allocated to the different confessional groups, with the Christians enjoying a slight advantage. And so one of the main causes of the civil war was this objection on the part of Lebanese Muslims, Sunni and Shia alike, although initially it was the Sunni who sounded this complaint most loudly and prominently, that the current arrangement was no longer fair, that there should be another census. If it were held, it would almost certainly show that the Muslims were now a majority, and the confessional system should either be reformed to reflect that majority, or it should be abolished altogether in favor of a more traditional democratic system. Nonetheless, so anyway, that's kind of a digression, but
no, I appreciate you clearing that up.
One of the reasons why you've got this civil war erupting in the mid-70s in the first place. So just to continue the narrative, you've got U.S. Marines stationed in Lebanon, ostensibly as peacekeepers and as promoters of stability, but in the eyes of many Lebanese and in the eyes of many people in the region more broadly, they are essentially taking sides in Lebanon's civil war. Reagan's unhappiness with the Israeli invasion notwithstanding, there is this view of the United States as Israel's primary military backer, which is not false, even though there had been moments when the United States suspended shipments to Israel and delayed certain agreements and so forth, the implementation of certain agreements. So there's this general sense that, okay, the Marines are there in Lebanon. They're siding with this Lebanese government, in the eyes of many Lebanese, does not have legitimacy, that is simply one faction in the civil war. And the United States is, on the heels of supporting this invasion of Lebanon, is now pressuring the Lebanese government to sign a peace treaty with Israel, known as the May 17th Agreement. It's May 17th, 1983, when Israel and Lebanon signed this treaty. Just the mere fact that this treaty has been signed in the wake of this very violent invasion of the country by Israel sets off a political explosion inside Lebanon. The Marines are sitting ducks in the midst of this conflagration. And what you increasingly see as you get into the spring and summer of 1983, various factions within Lebanon taking potshots at the Marines. And the Marines, at first, feeling quite constrained in their ability to respond, but increasingly the U.S. military does feel it has to shoot back. And then, of course, are these very spectacular attacks. First, the bombing of the U.S. Embassy in the spring of 1983. This is the event at which Robert Ames, the figure you mentioned earlier, is killed.
We're here at the orders of the president to accompany back to the United States the bodies of men and women who died for their country and for Lebanon.
We don't know yet who bears responsibility for this terrible deed. What we do know is that the terrorists who planned and carried out this cynical and cowardly attack have failed in their purpose. They mistakenly believe that if they're cruel enough and violent enough, they will weaken American resolve and deter us from our effort to help build a lasting and secure peace in the Middle East.
And then, of course, in October 83, the bombing of the Marine barracks that kills 241 servicemen.
I know there are no words that can express our sorrow and grief over the loss of those splendid young men and the injury to so many others. I know there are no words also that can ease the burden of grief for the families of those young men. Likewise, there are no words to properly express our outrage, and I think the outrage of all Americans, at the despicable act, following as it does on the one perpetrated several months ago in the spring that took the lives of scores of people at our embassy in that same city, in Beirut.
Essentially what has happened is that the Reagan administration has seriously miscalculated. And in particular, George Shultz has miscalculated because he assumed that because Syria had fared so poorly militarily during the invasion, the Israeli military really did a number on the Syrian military during that invasion and virtually wiped out the Syrian Air Force. So there was this sense in the Reagan administration, and this is something that George Shultz really seizes on, that Syria is in a very weakened position. And this is the moment when the United States can achieve a major diplomatic coup that severely isolates and marginalizes Syria. And that is basically to foster this agreement between Lebanon and Israel, the second major Arab country, or at least second Arab country to sign a peace treaty with Israel after Egypt has done so in 79. It creates this momentum where then, maybe next Jordan will do the same. And other pro-US Arab governments will make peace with Israel. You'll have this new order dominated by the United States. Maybe it would result in some kind of accommodation for the Palestinians, because there is a peace plan that Reagan issues.
I want to talk about that next.
In September 82, that calls for some kind of autonomy for the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, probably in confederation with Jordan. So something short of a Palestinian state, but something a lot more robust than anything Menachem Begin is willing to countenance. But it's based on the assumption that Syria will not be able to resist it. And that proves to be seriously mistaken, because Syria is very heavily involved in all of this pushback that the United States Marines are experiencing over the course of 1983.
We're talking about the origins of Hezbollah, correct? The Shia militia that believed to have been responsible, at least their founder, who's now dead, Imad Mughniya, the suicide bombings. Yes.
Right, because essentially what you have is an alliance between these radical Shia factions, Hezbollah being the most prominent, and Syria. So yes, and this is, of course, intimately connected to the Israeli invasion in the sense that the removal of the PLO from Lebanon created this power vacuum that was, in the subsequent years, increasingly filled by Lebanese Shia militias. There were some more moderate militias from the Shia community like Emel, but there were also some pretty hardline ones like Hezbollah, aligned with Iran and with Syria. Essentially, this coalition is at the forefront of the pushback against the Marines in Lebanon throughout 1983.
Is it safe to say that had Israel never invaded Lebanon in 1982, we would not have gotten Hezbollah?
Probably. I mean, it's always difficult to engage in
counterfactual.
these kinds of counterfactuals. And I'm sure a sophisticated historian of the Lebanese Shia would point to all sorts of ways or all sorts of reasons why there was bound to be some kind of resurgence of Shia political activism around this time. So maybe a lot of that would have happened anyway, but definitely the Israelis gave it a major push by removing what was, in a de facto sense, a barrier to Shia expansion, which was the presence of the PLO in Lebanon until 82.
So the Reagan peace plan, and this is something that Bob Ames had been working on, the Reagan plan, and you mentioned some of this before, but just referring to Inboden's book, called for Israel to freeze settlements in the West Bank and grant the Palestinian self-government, as you mentioned. It denied an independent state to the Palestinians, but they did get some autonomy. But no one was really happy with this. Then a few weeks later, we get the killing of Jamal and the Sabra and Shatila massacres, and I think the Reagan, I don't know if I'd call it a two-state solution, but a solution is sidetracked. This is really a low point in U.S.-Israel relations, but it's not a severing of the relationship. And just today, I think what mystifies some people about President Biden is that he appears, at least according to the critics, to be so afraid of being accused of abandoning Israel if he just simply criticizes Israel or threatens to withhold arms shipments to Israel if it doesn't use them in a way that adheres with, say, American law or international law. You get what I'm saying?
It's a really fascinating, although also extremely disturbing scenario that's unfolding right now. I mean, I think one thing that we should keep in mind when we make comparisons between what Biden is dealing with today and what Reagan confronted 40 years ago is the significant differences in circumstances between the two cases. This becomes especially visible when we focus on the period immediately after October 7th, as opposed to now, 6 months later, when the Israelis have been engaging in a massive military campaign that has resulted in all kinds of carnage. But in the immediate aftermath of October 7th, there was certainly this widespread view in the United States and in many countries that Israel had to respond. What it had endured or it had faced on October 7th was something just so horrific and intolerable that is just not realistic to expect them to do nothing.
And they also had a right to defend themselves as well, a right to. Yeah.
Right. So that's one major difference between Israel's war in Gaza and the 82 invasion of Lebanon. Although then there's all sorts of room for criticism of what Israel has done in that campaign, as well as criticism of what Israel did in the decades preceding October 2023 to create the situation that Hamas exploited.
Yeah, I mean, it's well documented now that Netanyahu had been supporting Hamas with Qatari money as a way of dividing the Palestinian leadership.
Absolutely. And also just continuing the occupation, refusing to deal seriously with the Palestinians, making it clear, and I'm talking about the position of the Netanyahu government, making it clear that Israel intends to remain in control of the West Bank and continue its siege of Gaza. So these are things that have been going on for years prior to October 7th. Critics can rightly point to those circumstances as making Israel's position after October 7th hardly one of clean hands. But nonetheless, in the immediate aftermath of October 7th, there was a real visceral reaction to what Israel had endured. Biden, of course, has long been very supportive of Israel, and I have no doubt that that feeling was really, really important in his response. Then, of course, as the campaign continues, as the civilian casualties mount, and as Israel is pretty clearly not achieving its strategic goals and not moving closer to a situation in which it can claim victory, then, of course, all sorts of questioning arises. And Biden, I think, has accommodated to that new reality in a very limited way.
Yeah, he
has rhetorically allowed more daylight to appear between the United States and Israel. I'm sure he authorized Chuck Schumer to make his critical comments about Netanyahu some weeks ago.
I believe in his heart he has his highest priority is the security of Israel. However, I also believe Prime Minister Netanyahu has lost his way by allowing his political survival to take the precedence over the best interests of Israel.
I think what he said is totally inappropriate. It's inappropriate for to go to a sister democracy and try to replace the elected leadership there. That's something that the Israeli public does on its own, and we're not a banana republic.
He's, from time to time, voiced criticism of what the Israelis are doing, and he's had conversations with Netanyahu in which I'm sure he's said things to the effect of, look, how much longer do you really need to continue this? Do you think you can wrap it up sometime soon?
Private conversations is probably the more effective way of doing it. You may not get very far by publicly shaming someone. But I think what people are saying is, okay, talk is fine and diplomacy is important. You can maybe try to pressure them privately. But until you either threaten sanctions or threaten to cut off weapon shipments, etc., you're not going to change the behavior. Now, maybe it's the administration's position that they really don't want to stop what's happening, or maybe they believe they really can't, but they're not trying. From the point of view of supporters of the Palestinian cause, President Biden, when he took office, he said, America is back.
America is back. Diplomacy is back at the center of our foreign policy. Around the world, we're seeing efforts to undermine the rules-based order. With China's increasingly coercive actions in the Indo-Pacific and beyond, with Russia's brutal and unprovoked war against its neighbor in Ukraine, with Iran's destabilizing activities.
Look at Ukraine, right? U.S. support of Ukraine. But in this situation, he's not applying any of that.
And that's unfortunately, a long-standing critique that one can make about U.S. policy toward this issue in particular. Kind of an exception that is granted to Israel. We can argue about why that is. People cite different causes, the pro-Israel lobby, the special status that Israel has in American psyche because of the Holocaust, and so forth. But I very strongly share the dismay others have expressed about the failure to really uphold this notion of a rules-based order when it comes to Israel's behavior in and around the Israel-Palestine arena. Of course, there are ways in which Israel's adversaries have made it easier for Israel to take these positions just because of the extremism and brutality of their own conduct, Hamas being Exhibit A, but also, the fact that Iran has, been moving toward acquiring a nuclear weapons capability at the same time that it has from time to time issued statements about how it would be great if Israel were wiped off the map. Things like that. And of course, the behavior of Hezbollah in Lebanon. It's always possible for supporters of Israel to point to those factors and say, well, look, what choice do they have? They're surrounded by countries and groups that are seeking their destruction. No country can tolerate that kind of a situation. But I think it's inherent in the circumstances under which that state came into being and the failure or refusal of that state's leaders to really come to grips with that and try to reach some kind of a political accommodation with the Palestinians.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, Hezbollah is a major fighting force now, has thousands of rockets and missiles in Lebanon pointed at Israel. But it's a matter, or it's a question of what's effective. Does this bring Israel closer to peace? Does it bring the Palestinians closer to achieving their national aspirations? Because there will be no sustainable, the way I define the term peace, but a sustainable resolution to a conflict where the chance of war exploding again is minimal. I don't want to say zero, but minimal.
Sure, never zero.
Yeah. Yeah. So we had this situation going back and forth between Israel and Hamas in Gaza ever since, about 2007, 2008, after the Israelis left and then put in the blockade, land, air, and sea blockade.
I have a pretty firm view that the only path towards some kind of sanity is the political one. But I can well understand how perilous that path is. And right now, the situation is so dire that it's difficult to say exactly what should happen. Okay, so yes, it would be great if there were a ceasefire, if the hostages were returned. But then what? Do we allow Hamas to remain a major force in Palestinian governance? If that happens, if Hamas continues, what role, if any, could they play in a diplomatic process between Israel and the Palestinians? I mean, the most optimistic scenario, I think, is one in which Hamas is not eradicated, it can't be, but it becomes increasingly irrelevant to the politics of the region, and recognizing that it accommodates itself to those politics and elements within it that in the past have shown some willingness to compromise gain ascendancy, and they become the face of Hamas.
From what I understand, there are people within Hamas who are less of a dead ender than those others.
Right, exactly. To some extent, we can point to historical precedent, although it's a tenuous connection. We talked earlier about the position that the PLO took in the 1970s. It sort of inched toward acceptance of a two-state settlement because, it started out with this very militant rhetoric. Oh, the armed struggle continues. We will never stop until victory. In the meantime, we will set up a state in whatever territory we liberate. But don't worry, we're going to keep fighting. And that eventually becomes, okay, this is the territory that we are confining our ambitions to, and we'll be happy to have not happy, but we'll be satisfied to have a state there. So there's this evolution in the PLO position that unfolded over a decade or so along those lines. Now, in the past, elements of Hamas have said things like, well, we are not opposed to a ceasefire with Israel, even one lasting 50 years. But, of course, in the end, we're going to liberate all of Palestine and establish an Islamic state. I mean, it's less likely in this scenario, just because of the kind of militant nature of Hamas's ideology. But still, it's not completely inconceivable that this becomes the mechanism by which elements within Hamas accommodate themselves to diplomatic realities. And so while they may never formally endorse Israel, they may never formally renounce the goal of liberating all of Palestine and establishing an Islamic state, they can sort of say, well, for now, and for now can mean the next few decades, we are willing to support this process that results in achievement of Palestinian sovereignty in the West Bank and Gaza. I mean, that's probably the most optimistic scenario that one can envision. But it's so much more appealing than any of the alternatives that I think people should do all they can to push in that direction.
We will not be discouraged or deterred in our efforts to seek peace in Lebanon and a just and lasting peace throughout the Middle East. All of us must learn the appropriate lessons from this tragedy and assume the responsibilities that it imposes upon us. We owe it to ourselves and to our children. The whole world will be a safer place when this region, which has known so much trouble, can begin to know peace instead. Both our purpose and our actions are peaceful, and we're taking them in a spirit of international cooperation. So tonight, I ask for your prayers and your support as our country continues its vital role as a leader for world peace. a role that all of us as Americans can be proud of.
On the next episode of History as It Happens, you know the word ally is overused. For instance, the United States and Israel are not treaty allies. The United States and the Philippines are, and we're going to take a look at that alliance and what's happening in the South China Sea. Next, as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.